Buenos días a todos. Good morning, everyone. My name is Allison. I'm here with the Community Language Cooperative to provide interpretation services this morning with my colleague, Jasmine. Mi nombre es Allison. Estoy aquí de la Cooperativa de Lenguaje Comunitaria para proporcionar servicios de interpretación esta mañana con mi colega, Yasmin. The organizers of this event have made a commitment to providing language justice in this space. With language justice, we seek to create spaces in which there is no one language that is dominant, in which everyone can speak in the language that is most comfortable to them, the language of their heart and of their home. Los organizadores de este evento han hecho un compromiso hoy a la justicia del lenguaje. La justicia del lenguaje busca crear espacios en que no haya ningún lenguaje dominante, en que todos puedan hablar en el lenguaje de su corazón, de su hogar. To achieve this objective, we have two options available today. We have this room, the main room for English, and we also have a room available in Spanish. You can access that room by clicking the green arrow where it says Para Español in the upper left-hand corner if you'd prefer to listen and participate in Spanish today. Para el día de hoy, para lograr este objetivo, tenemos dos opciones. Tenemos este cuarto, que es el cuarto principal en inglés, y también tenemos un cuarto principal para hispanohablantes. Pueden acceder al cuarto a través de hacer clic en la cajita verde en la mano izquierda de la pantalla si prefieres escuchar y participar en español. If you're experiencing any sort of technological difficulties, please let one of the moderators or tech support folks know as soon as possible. We don't want anyone to suffer in silence and want to make a space where everyone can participate fully. Si experimentas algo de dificultad con la tecnología, por favor, déjelo saber al moderador o al tech support para que podamos ayudar de una vez. No queremos que sufran en silencio, sino queremos crear un espacio en que todos puedan participar plenamente. Thank you so much for having us. Muchas gracias por tenernos.
Thanks so much, Allison. And hello and welcome everyone back to the Hungry for Change Summit Day 2. And welcome to the Remo platform. My name is Kelby Johnson and I work as a virtual event consultant for the Alliance Center. And if you attended yesterday's event, this will be a lot of the same information, but I just want to give everyone a quick introduction to the platform and how it works. So as you might have experienced yesterday, Remo is a little bit different than a normal Zoom. In Remo, you are able to communicate with others at virtual tables. And you might have had a chance to check out these tables before you jumped into the presentation mode, but if you haven't quite gotten a feel for it, we will be jumping back into those tables after this presentation for some discussion time. Now, while in this presentation mode, you are able to chat with the entire group through the general chat on your right side. And you also have the ability to chat with people at the last table you visited or privately chat with other attendees one-on-one. You are also able to see a full list of participants on that right side. And if at any point you need any help, you can search for myself labeled as tech support and message me directly with any questions. And you can also look through the attendee list for hunger-free staff that have a green star next to their names, and you can message them as well. We also will be having staff members monitoring the general chat, but if you'd like to ask any questions to the speakers, you can also click on the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen as well and type in questions to that area. You also have the ability to vote on different questions that you would like to be addressed, and any questions that are put into the chat, we will also be moving those over to the Q&A tab to get answered as well. After the presentation, we will be moving back to the virtual table section, and most of those are labeled with sponsors' names and have information about the companies within the tables, which I'll talk about in a little, but feel free to join any table that's available. And up to 6 people can sit at each table and network and converse, but there's 5 floors for the event, so don't worry about not being able to find a place to sit. And to move from table to table, you just need to double click on the table you'd like to move to, and you can also click and drag and zoom in and out on the floor as well. When you arrive to the table, just be sure to turn on your video and audio when you join the table so others can talk to you and see you and hear you. And to do this, the controls are found at the bottom of your screen in the footer. If you would like to check out another floor, you can also click on floors 1 through 5 on the left-hand side of your screen, and that will move you to another one. And to access the Spanish translated version of the event, you can click on the green button up at the top left corner, and that will get you to the translated version of this event. And we also will be dropping that link to get to the Spanish event in the chat. On the floor, you will also notice other pictures around the edges of the room where you can click on the banner image and learn more about the different sponsors. And you also can click on the sponsor video at the top left of the room to learn more as well. And just be sure to check out the other billboard on the other side of the room on the upper right, where you can enter to win a copy of Farming While Black, and you can use different tags for the event on your social. And also in the upper right, you can see a little calendar icon, and that button will show you the agenda for today's event, so you can follow along with that. And another awesome feature Remo has is the ability to exchange virtual business cards. So that will make it so you can learn more about others. So you just need to click on an attendee's circular avatar at the table or when you're moving around, and you'll be able to click on their Facebook, LinkedIn, and website links, as well as message them privately. And please make sure to add your own information by clicking on the account on your account, your specific avatar. And in the top right corner of your screen, you can add in your email. You can add in any information about yourself. And we're asking that you put your email address in the header section so you're also able to connect that way. We also will be using whiteboards at each table to help facilitate our discussion. So that is on the bottom footer along with other controls. And you can also click on that whiteboard button to take you where the discussion questions are for the day. And there will also be more information about specific sponsors. And lastly, with any virtual call, just make sure you are, just make sure you're muting yourself and to avoid any background noise. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful event, and I'm going to turn it over to Mark Jacobson, the CEO of Hunger Free Colorado. Thanks so much. Mark.
Thank you so much. Hi, my name is Mark Jacobson, and I am the CEO of Hunger Free Colorado. Our mission at Hunger Free Colorado is to connect people to food resources to meet existing needs and drive policy, systems, and social change to end hunger. We envision a Colorado in which everyone has equitable access to the nutritious food needed to thrive and reach their full potential. Thank you so much for joining us for day 2 of our Hungry for Change, Realizing a More Just Food System Summit. Before we begin, we would like to honor and recognize the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations on whose traditional territory we reside in what is today known as Colorado. We acknowledge them as past, present, and future caretakers and stewards of this land. We also recognize the 48 contemporary tribal nations that are historically tied to these lands through trade, gathering, and healing. Further, we recognize the contributions and importance of Indigenous nations and their foodways, food systems, and lands in nourishing our communities, despite ongoing threats to their cultures and the legacy of oppression and inequities that we all have a collective responsibility to recognize and dismantle. As we get started, I want to offer a special thanks to our sponsors for their generous support that has allowed us to put on this free event. Most notably our equity sponsors, the Mad Friends, BBVA Bank, and the Colorado Health Foundation. We encourage you to learn more about them and why ending hunger is a priority for them by clicking on their names on the main floor and by watching the sponsor video. We also greatly appreciate our corporate sponsors whose names are on each of the tables. You can learn more about them by clicking on your table's whiteboard. This year's summit is focused on understanding the historical roots of food insecurity in Colorado and thinking broadly and boldly about the work we need to do together to truly end hunger. With the pandemic causing 1 in 3 Coloradans to be food insecure, more than 3 times the pre-COVID rate, it is clear that working to end hunger must be about strengthening and expanding access to key nutrition programs like SNAP and school meals, but it must also involve paying attention to and supporting policies that can create can address wealth and income gaps that drive food insecurity, to address unjust immigration policies that create opportunity barriers for immigrants of color, and policies that address land and farm policies that hinder the development of strong local food systems that provide access to culturally appropriate, nutritious food. Yesterday, we learned a lot about these and other related issues and lifted up many opportunities for cross-sectoral collaboration. We hope to continue that discussion today. I'm excited that today we will have a chance to dig in on issues with Leah Penniman, one of the foremost national experts on food justice and building equitable, anti-racist food systems. Leah Penniman is a Black Creole farmer, author, mother, and food justice activist who has been tending the soil and organizing for an anti-racist food system for over 20 years. She currently serves as founding co-executive director of Soul Fire Farm in Grafton, New York, a people of color-led project that works towards food and land justice. Leah has also written an amazing book that I'm sure many of you have read, hopefully. If you haven't, you should, called Farming While Black, Soul Fire Farm's Practical Guide to Liberation on the Land. We're thrilled to have Leah join us this morning to have a one-on-one conversation with Fatuma Imad, co-founder, executive director, and head farmer of Frontline Farming. As many of you heard yesterday, Fatuma has incredible insights to share, and I'm looking forward to this dynamic conversation that will explore the on-the-ground work of building equitable, community-driven food systems that are rooted in racial justice. Before I pass the virtual mic over to Fatuma, I did want to lay out the rest of the agenda this morning. After the conversation between Leah and Fatuma, you will have an opportunity for a break and small group discussion at your virtual tables before we come back together for our second annual Kathy Underhill Scholarship Award ceremony. We'll see a video featuring the awesome work that the award finalists are doing across the state. Then we'll announce and hear from this year's winner. And afterwards, we'll have a fascinating conversation between last year's winner, Fatuma, this year's winner, who you'll learn, and the award namesake and founder of Hunger Free Colorado, Kathy Underhill. And then before we close, Ashley Wieland, Hunger Free Colorado's Director of Public Policy, will provide a quick policy update, including information on the Colorado Legislature's recent special session. And one final announcement, just to reiterate that today we are giving away a copy of Leah Penniman's book, Farming While Black, Soul Fire Farm's Practical Guide to Liberation on the Land. And to enter to win, you just need to post on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter about the summit or something you've learned and tag us. So with that, I'll invite Fatuma and Leah to join us on stage by turning on their camera and mic. And then I will pass over the mic to them and look forward to this great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mark. Hi, Fatuma. I'm so excited for our conversation.
Likewise. All right. Welcome, everyone. As you all can see, we're super excited to have this conversation and be in conversation this morning. And we just wanted to start off by kind of letting you all know that today's conversation is really co-facilitated by Leah and I, and we've put some thought into what we really want to bring here and to make it reflective of a way that we want to engage. We wanted to really, give gratitude for starting off the day with the land acknowledgement, which is so important. And we know that word sound matters and acknowledgements matter. And we also want to encourage people to think about what it means to go beyond land acknowledgements. And if you're here in Colorado, think of some organizations like the Four Winds Center, the Sekia Institute, Spirit of the Sun, and communities we can directly support, particularly as we're seeing that what happens with relief money and the CARES Act even being held up still for our Indigenous communities. So we really want to encourage that. So we're going to talk for a little bit, Leah and I, and we'll talk for about 50 minutes, and then we'll really open it up to take some of the questions, and I'll also try to watch and keep it in our conversation as we go on. And I wanted to take a moment to kind of ask everybody to just really reflect today on what the intention you are bringing here with you is, and to really maybe cultivate and maybe carry that with you to your breakout sessions and discuss that. And I know for Leah and we've really set an intention to show up as whole humans today and to tell our own stories. So with no further ado, one way we'd like to do that is by really starting off introducing ourselves and talking to more of the seeds that we carry to tell our own stories. So Leah, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Fatuma. And thank you for that acknowledgement that it's more than words, but action that's needed in all of our solidarity work. I'm Leah. My pronouns are Li, Eye, she, he, and we. And I am the granddaughter of Brownlee McCullough, who is a daughter of the Great Migration, where 6 million Black people fled the racist violence of the rural South in hopes of a different and better way. And my grandmother didn't want to let go of her close connection with the earth. So even as she moved to the paved streets of Boston, living in Roxbury and later in the outlying areas of Boston, she carried with her the strawberry patch that she had grown up with and planted it in the yard. She carried with her her nourishment of apple trees and her practice of making jam and making foods from these fruits for her family. And that was my first exposure to growing food and preserving food with my own hands from being a very small child in my grandmother's garden. So my heart is feeling tender to her in blessed memory in this moment. And my heart is also feeling tender and open to my living mentor, one of my living mentors, Karen Washington, who works at Rocksteady Farm and Flowers, who also is the founder of Black Urban Growers, a national network of Black folks who love the earth. And, you know, if it wasn't for Mama Karen, I think I would have given up a long time ago because it was very challenging. I've been farming now almost 25 years, starting as a teenager, and, you know, being one of the only brown folks in these spaces about food and farming is challenging, to say the least. It's grating. It led me to feelings of whether I was a betrayer to my people, you know, whether I was had any belonging or anything to offer in these spaces. And Mama Karen was one of the few other people, folks of color, Black folks there. And she's like, don't give up, child. You know, one day we'll have our book, one day we'll have our conference. Little did we know that we'd both have a big hand in having that book and that conference. But I thank Mama Karen and all the elders who just encourage us and help us to see over our stumbling blocks. And, you know, as you know, my life's work is Soul Fire Farm. It is a sacred bundle of seeds that is dedicated to uprooting racism and planting sovereignty in this food system. And we do our best to do our small and humble part in a much wider movement as members of Via Campesina, as members of the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, the Heal Food Alliance, you know, Black Farmers United New York, and many other coalitions that really represent the we of this sacred bundle. So thank you. And Fatuma, I think it's going to also introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. Beautiful. And yeah, shout out to Karen. I think she's done that for a lot of people, and I share that sentiment. I wanted to honor this time in my own story today through that story of those we selectively call immigrants. I come from Ethiopia and Yemen, which right now are in the midst of war or under siege, in the case of Yemen, by countries like the United States. And what we see and what could have been predicted is some of the most historical famines, and we see that even hitting Ethiopia. So we know that the stories of immigration are both about push and pull factors. And I give gratitude for the languages, the foods, the ways of knowledge that has been brought to us. I think of how it is truly people like my mother and my grandmother who hold the knowledge and answers for the futures that we're seeking. As I've been traveling across the state working with ag workers, I've been so humbled in even the language justice space, where there might be one person on our crew who might be there for tech support and doesn't speak Spanish, and they will stop everything to translate every part, even when we say that it doesn't need to be translated, because they have that empathy and bring that empathy and grace back to people. at home, I live with my Baba, my elder. It's me and him. He's about over 80 years old, and we roll deep. And actually, I like to say that he caretakes me. And whenever I come home with a story about, being othered in those ways, being called immigrants and those stories, he always says to me, "Oh no, darling, they just don't understand. You're cosmopolitan." And so I carry that into this space with us this morning. So as I said, my name's Fatuma Imad, and shout out to everyone out there here joining us, and thank you for valuing our voices and coming to hear us today. So I'm going to kick into some of the questions that Leah and I were thinking about that we thought could help generate some good conversation. We knew that we could rap for a long time, so we were trying to create a little bit of structure. So I wanted to ask you, Leah, today, what really has brought you to this way of life, and how do you sustain yourself in it?
So I intentionally didn't ask you to clarify when you wrote this question what you meant by sustaining, because I think there's a spiritual sustenance, there is an economic sustenance, right? And so many other layers of that. But I would say, to be really honest, what brought me to this work is an ancestor's errand. It's instructions from the earth. I remember being a small child with my sister Naima, and we were pretty solitary. I mean, we had, as the only brown kids in our school, in a place that's conservative and rural, there was a lot of racialized bullying. There was a lot of peer exclusion. We'd have a few friends here and there, but mostly it was us, the siblings. And we spent a lot of time in the forest developing this intimate, passionate relationship with the divinity of nature. And we even thought we invented our own religion of nature reverence, only to find out in young adulthood that this was a remembering and not an invention. And in traveling and living in Ghana, West Africa, and later in Haiti, practicing Ifa, practicing Vodun, seeing that these were our ways. But through that spiritual practice in childhood, this idea of really the destiny for both of us being in alignment with defense of the earth and the people who love the earth has been unwavering, and it's taken many forms. So that also, I mention that because I think it relates to sustenance. I want to make no illusions that this is a glorified role. It is incredibly difficult to be a farmer. Anyone who's labored in a field, even for a few days, much less like year after year, knows the toll that it can take on the body, the spirit. When you plant a whole crop and then it's decimated by pests or by the wildfires or climate chaos, flooding, that the sort of battering of being at the whims of nature and natural and unnatural disaster, the economic pressures that we're under with the way that the extractive food system is set up. It's actually nearly impossible. It is actually impossible to make a living on a farm without some type of exploitation. And so that's why there's so many side hustles for those who aren't willing to exploit and need to make ends meet. So the agritourism, the value add, all of these pieces. And then movement work. We have very, very high rates of mental illness in our movement spaces. And that's connected to many things, but not least of which is of going up against these massive systems of oppression day in and day out, experiencing the lateral violence, experiencing the harassment and threats that come with visibility. So there is nothing easy about this work. And the only way that I can sustain myself in it is with the fortitude of my ancestors in the earth who keep reminding me of that errand and somehow finding that font of wisps of strength to push forward. So that's a spiritual sustenance. And then of course it's helpful when we have victories, when we have impact, big and small, and I'll tell you a small one because this wasn't so publicized, but there's a wonderful African-American farming community in the tiny city of Albany, New York, that's been there since the early 1900s. They were a sharecropper family that moved up from the South to try to escape the violence that they were experiencing. And they set up a farm in a place that was rural at one point, and now it's being encroached by all sorts of development. And they've been fighting back the apartment buildings and the malls and the dumps and incinerators, like fighting. And it honestly looked like hope was lost, that this community would just be bulldozed and cornered in and erased. But through citizen activism and through a lawsuit, we actually got to stop a development. We just found out last week. And so it's those moments too that also like remind us that even though what we're fighting for is big and we might not ever see the promised land, so to speak, that these little victories along the way remind us what is possible, and keep us moving forward. So how'd you get into this, Fatuma, and what sustains you?
Yeah, thank you. I'm reflecting on some of what you said and appreciate your comment about remembering and not invention is such a valuable thing. Even we think about it a lot in terms of ways that it's done to us, but we also, I'm always like, don't think you're reinventing the wheel here, so that's valuable. I think that, as I said, my family's from Ethiopia and Yemen, and I was born in Denver and actually moved back to Ethiopia when I was in 3rd grade, and the war ended there, and grew up most of my life there. And so I've been lucky to have the experience of living in different spaces. And growing up in the US, people often thought of Ethiopia as just a country of famine, particularly in the 80s. And so food was always in my mind in that way, and certainly would see the struggles at home, and also was confused by how a place that is called the land of 13 months of sunshine, the land, a place in Africa that has one of the highest points and one of the lowest points on earth, that's both mountainous and can grow cold stone fruits, but can also grow all sorts of warm season climate stuff, and now centers and is a place where so much of that land buying on global levels is trying to happen, and boasts the largest greenhouses in the world, put in by a Dutch company that you can even see from space. And when I've seen it, you can't even see the end of it. So we're now in this reality where people recognize that, and it's about capitalizing on that. And so I always wondered, how could food and how could a famine exist in a place that was so rich in food? And that question really led me on a path and informed me, one, from a justice perspective of seeing people hungry, and two, from just trying to understand the political nature of it. And mainly my assumptions were that the world was benevolent, politicians are benevolent, but there's some sort of mistake going on. And so I really pursued it as a good child of immigrants through trying to pursue higher education. And in pursuing higher education, it was kind of that myth I tell myself, or people will, well, where the higher you get up, the more or less racist that space will be. And that was a hard myth to learn in graduate school. And, I remember as a child playing soccer, when people would say racist things to me, kids on the field, and I would tell my family. And when the first time it happened and their parents said it to me on the field, and I was so in shock, because I always thought, if only their parents heard. And when I went to my mother and told her, and she was like, what do you expect? That's where it came from. And so I had to learn that lesson in a hard way in graduate school, that those same spaces perpetuate those ways of thinking, that African studies isn't even a whole comparative politics field anymore within political science, that people pontificating on these things have never grown a carrot. And so as I did my work with smallholder farmers in East and Southern Africa, and they really welcomed me because I looked like them and spoke languages and were proud of me, but I couldn't answer simple questions about the things that were actually affecting them. I was researching GMO seeds and working against that, which is being flooded across Africa right now. And the questions they asked me were about irrigation, pest management, all the things they say are the issues. And I realized I was a part of instrumentalizing that knowledge, and who was I really doing it for? To write a book for the global north. And so at that time, I paused and knew that I needed to become a farmer and to honor the way of my country and people, which is primarily agrarian. And so that's what brought me there. And yeah, it's those same things that have sustained me. It's the same things that have made us resilient in those stories of traveling and rebuilding, but also in the ways that we have been othered or being told in how to grow and what our best practices. So I think what sustains me continuously is land, of course, earth. The earth is there regardless of what people name it. And of course, my communities and people, which are my greatest assets. So thanks for that question, Leah. So I'm going to ask you another question that hopefully we're going to kind of gear and direct us towards some things that take us a little towards actions as well. And so in the second question, I wanted to ask you, Leah, is there an ethics that informs the work you do specifically? And is there a way that you came to cultivating that ethics and sustaining it in the plight of changing times or adversity?
Well, I would say if there's an underlying ethic to our work at Soulfire Farm, and by extension, the returning generation, Black and Brown farming movement, it would be one of sacred biomimicry. And by that, I mean that we hold an ethos that human beings are not supreme, but that we are the younger siblings in creation, and that our rightful place is as students of the rocks, the stars, the mountains, the trees, the rivers, the fish. And that sounds philosophical, but maybe I'll give an example, right? So we'll get a lot of pressure from broader community, society, funders saying, oh, well, you know, Soulfire Farm has this waiting list for farmer training. Why don't you grow bigger? Why don't you franchise and create all of these replicate programs or a national initiative in that way? And as we reflect upon that model of growth and this assumption, right? If I were to tell you, you know, year one, we fed 100 people. Year two, we fed 200. Year three, we fed 300. Year four, we fed 75. You would say, oh my goodness, what broke, right? What happened? So this idea of growth, this capitalist idea of growth and expansion, I think has become so embedded that even in our movement spaces, it's almost unquestioned as the way to measure success. And when you look at the forest, so biomimicry, right? Imagine a tree that is sitting towards the edge of the forest. So she's getting some extra shine, she's getting some extra sunlight, not as shaded, and making more sugars, photosynthates. That tree doesn't actually grow like 10, 20, 30 times taller than all the other trees, right? Even if that amount of sunlight is there, that tree will take the extra sugars that are not needed and dump them into a network of fungal mycelium to be shared amongst the other trees, both relatives, kin, and non-relatives, same species, other species throughout the forest. And this type of sharing of minerals, sugars, warnings is what makes it possible for the trees to coordinate these very important defenses. So for example, nut trees have what's called a mast year. So they will, rather than everybody making a little bit of acorns on different years, they'll decide together, like this is the year we're all going to make a ton of acorns. And the reason is to overwhelm the herbivores who otherwise would eat up everybody's little bits of acorns and leave no children left to grow. But if you can overwhelm the herbivores in a year, it means that you'll have some surviving children. And that is not possible. That coordination is not possible without that sharing. So we have said, no, growth for us doesn't look like being a tree that's like 20, 30 times taller than others. It means figuring out how to imperfectly and learning as we go, like take and redirect resources. Another example of sacred biomimicry would be the lesson of patience. So when you look at whether it's a strawberry plant, a peach or apple tree, if you think about how can I get the most fruit as quickly from this plant as possible, that will lead you down a road of reducing your yields over the long term, right? So if you're going for super dwarf rootstock and very fast growing. You're making a tree that's susceptible to disease, that cannot weather climate chaos, that won't grow in our tough mountain soils, will give you fruit for a little while and then it will die, right? If you try to, harvest your strawberries in year 1 rather than letting them mature into year 2, you are actually impeding their ability to invest in their rootstock. So thinking about that lesson of patience and deliberation before action is another example of an ethic. And, this is, we're not all ethereal. I mean, this translates into serious policies that we have organizationally and movement-wise around workers' rights and how we treat one another in spaces in very clear, defined, and audited ways from external auditors. It translates into the rules about what type of money we take and what type of money we don't take, and how much we're going to let those with inherited privilege control our work, which is not very much, and so on. But it is difficult to sustain because we're trying to build an alternative while still operating inside of the status quo. And so navigating the necessary compromise for existing and survival alongside this ethos of ancient wisdom around how to be like water, be like mountain, just means, thousands of imperfect micro decisions, day to day about what is yes and what is no. So thank you for that. And Fatuma, I am really curious about the ethic that sustains your work and how you hold on to it in the face of all the challenges.
Wow, thank you. That was wonderful, and been really engaging in biomimicry even last night in our Black and Brown Growers Collective because of Franklin Cruz, who is probably listening in and teaches us a lot and brings it back to that. And it's such a good way of breaking out of your own paradigms in your mind to think about possibilities of where things can flow. And so we, in terms of structure itself, because it's always like, how do we organize? But we don't want to organize in these ways that things are set up. So he was giving us the example of cells and how cells break and regenerate themselves and yet maintain the functions that they were given. So it's really helpful way to understand things. Thank you. What is our ethics? Yeah, I think that what you said about patience and deliberation really resonates with me, and a lot of what you were saying about trying to create an alternative system, the other spaces, while still having to exist and abide by laws, in this land we're at. Our greatest fear as POC is, being imprisoned. That's a real fear that we carry with us. Translates to filling out paperwork, buying houses, like it's a real thing, and so when we organize alternatively as well and we create those systems, it takes so much trust in it and a certain type of kind of commitment to a vision that you keep, moving forward. And it doesn't always fit within these paradigms of liability and accountability and legal structures. So I've really been sitting in that space a lot of trying to figure out how we future cast while still caught up in this reality of this world. And so I think one of the things that we really focus on is just strategy as well. Making sure that we're safe in spaces, entering spaces where we might be the only POC in it, particularly policy spaces. It can be really destructive to your spirit, make you feel like you're crazy for speaking to really basic liberation for yourself or your communities. And when at least there's somebody else in the room with you to amplify your voice or to resonate with after, it has a lot of healing capacity. So we've reflected a lot on what strategy means in terms of, approaching and trying to create certain outcomes that we might be seeking collectively, but also what does strategy mean in sustaining ourselves and that vibration and love and dignity while we do the work, and not letting it tear us down individually that's not sustainable. And so how you are also able to hold systems of information, but also ensure that other people hold those systems of information. So raising leaders has been one of the greatest things to me. Oftentimes when you go to meetings, everyone's like, oh, the ED's late. They're just late. They're going to be late. They're so busy. And people always say to me, like, how do you do so much? And it can become overwhelming when people are always saying that to you. And my co-founder, Dr. Damian Thompson, and good friend, told me one day, he was like, you have to see that that's just a projection of their own use of time and space on you, and even when a funder said that to us, he was like, well, if you feel that way, you should probably give us more funding, if you feel like Fatuma is going to burn out. But really, one of the ways that we've been able to sustain that is like, I don't need to be the person representing us on stage. I don't need to be the person going to every meeting. And so sometimes I feel like I can exist multidimensionally because I have that trust and faith that I've cultivated with people that can show up in spaces and really hold. We can all say things in different ways and have different positionality, but hold to what we've all collectively really trying to manifest and know what we're clearly fighting in those ways. So that's been, an ethics and what's sustained me. And I'm going to shift it here. Did you want to follow up, Leah?
I feel like we could have this whole conversation about burnout prevention, but we're not. We're going to talk about solutions for food sovereignty. So let's do it. Okay. Did you actually want to start? Because I've been starting all the questions. I would love to hear, especially if you're with all solutions first, and then we can get into the things that we're excited about and championing. But, I've experienced in these spaces that so often things are held up as the way forward, and they've got a lot of glitz and glam and gloss, and folks will go in that direction, and it can divert energy from true systems change. And I'm curious if you want to speak to any of those false gods that you've witnessed.
Yeah, totally. And just, even before entering into thinking about like those significant barriers, and people always ask me that, and it's like, my most significant barrier, one of, is racism, how deep and entrenched it is, right? And oftentimes, or as my Baba had taught me too, and I've reflected on it, it's like, I didn't know that I was supposed to be Black or brown until probably like 3 years after I was born. You know what I mean? We're supposed to be these things that we're made to believe that we are. And oftentimes I don't see myself in those ways until I walk into spaces and see it reflected in the eyes of people or in the institutions and spaces that I'm coming to. And so I feel like so much has been about, telling our own stories. And so many of those false, solutions that I see have a lot to do for me with even just metrics themselves. And this focus on metrics in food systems and food movements work that I haven't seen improving our communities. I haven't seen bringing greater food to them. I haven't seen improving nutrition. And although they're often proposed and there's all these, funding, proposals for them and people allocated money, when you come back the next year, it's the bad, statistics that are being touted to get more money. And so I find that so many of the metrics and ways that engagement around food systems work has really been unfolding is really the age-old narrative of reading Black and brown bodies and focusing on individuals, or even things that are focused on consumer choice, when we know that the issues that we're facing are systematic. And it feels like when you address the direct topics or issues, people want to just avoid that. And I really suffered and experienced that, in working for ag workers over so many years in every room, and being shut down and being told that's, a labor issue, that's a federal issue. And grateful that, people are finally caring about it. But the fact that across food systems work, we don't include even metrics for food systems workers. And it's put in this politicized arena where people don't even touch it. And when I look through all these different organizations and different work around food systems, you know, really there's the moment of the urban farm being big and all these different, you know, ups and downs and the waves, like we're in right now, and that's great, you know. But it makes me sad to see that essential component that makes it of the workers themselves is just not included. And so I think there's a lot of solutions that are out there that are not really addressing in any way the fundamental problems. And it rocks the boat when you do it, you know? So when we've been trying to work on the good food purchasing policy here and we build coalitions, of course, the big players within that coming to coalitions aren't necessarily going to be in support of a new purchasing standard that is framed based on ethics. And so you're up in some fights. And it's the same with like the meat packing industry. That is scary. That is some powerful, powerful people that can affect organizations and individuals. And so while not directly answering the question in a specific way, I guess it's just saying like the patterns that I think give us false solutions.
I appreciate that pattern framing too, because I think similarly, I'll name 3 examples that I think lead us down the wrong road. So one echoes and amplifies your point on metrics, and that is anytime we are looking for quarterly returns rather than generational returns, I have a concern. Because a system that took several hundred years, a system of oppression that took several hundred years to foment will not be dismantled in 3 months or even 3 years. It actually will take generations to completely redesign and to make it just. And so, but the way that we operate in a capitalist system, including the ways that we're forced to operate oftentimes when we're a nonprofit organization or a public institution, is based on the quarterly return cycle, the annual review cycle, or at most like a 4-year political cycle. So looking at scale and time scale is really crucial. I think another point, again, echoing and amplifying what you started to get at about the consumer choice, I think that has been held up so strongly as the way forward, so that folks, and you know, I hope I don't offend anybody, but you know, folks will imagine like, oh, if I'm just vegan, or if I just drive a Prius, or if I just XYZ, right? Then not only have I made a difference, but I'm actually absolved from scratching any deeper, looking below the surface at the root cause. And there is abundant, you know, research out there that these type of individual consumer purchases actually have small impact overall, whether you're looking at environmental, public health, worker rights. I'm not talking about organized consumer choice. Boycotts work, right? Institutional purchasing, sign-on programs, you know, and the Real Meals campaign, that works when we organize our dollar power. But the individual, you know, I'm going to get oat milk in my latte instead of like cow milk in my latte and now I'm good, does not actually impact change. So the third thing that I want to mention is when we think that people from outside a community know the solutions better than the impacted community, right? And so, and this is really rampant, you know, like a funded white-led nonprofit that's, you know, plopped itself down in a community saying, you know, I know what this community needs in order to have healthy outcomes. They're going to need to learn to make kale salad. And so I, you know, benevolent person, will write a grant to pay myself a sweet salary to go teach kale salad making after school classes in the public school for these children who frankly, like, that it's so disconnected from what they need. And then those resources that are coming in the name of food security or food access really fundamentally benefit that institution and not the people who are most impacted. And this idea that we need a savior, that we need somebody to educate us about what's best for us is really misguided. And the people who are most impacted by issues are the experts. We know the solutions. We've been working on them. And oftentimes the barrier is that these solutions, these community-based solutions, are ignored, marginalized, underfunded, disparaged. And so finding ways to get behind Black and Brown leadership in the farm space, the food space, the workers' rights space is fundamentally that's the topic sentence for all other solutions that will come below, is like, what are the impacted people saying needs to happen, and what are they doing, and how do we shift power and resources in that direction? So with that, I think we're going to talk a little bit about some solutions that are promising for us. Do you want to go first?
I'm going to give this to you, Leah, to kick us off and really center this conversation with you because of the awesome experience and some amazing things that have been coming up. And there's so much to say here. And so I want to, ask you, in terms of those solutions, what is being lifted up as revolutionary and is getting to these root causes of things, and what are some of the wins that you're seeing that you want to share with us today?
Well, I'll tell you a couple of things that I'm excited about, and I'll acknowledge that it is, I don't know if I would call any of this revolutionary, because I think we're still operating within systems, but this is some really badass, amazing stuff that's happening. So first, a national coalition of Black farmers and Black farming organizations, have been working together now for many years, but on the specific initiative for about a year or so. And this coalition came together because Senator Elizabeth Warren, who at the time was running for the presidency, or the nomination of her party, put out a platform about how to fix ag in America. And that platform did not mention anything, anything about Black farmers or land loss or, the racialized food system at all. And so there was a few of us who wrote a letter pointing out and suggesting that changes be made. And it was signed widely. And to the credit of the Warren staff and campaign, they wanted to meet and they wanted to hear more. And so we had a series of town halls with Black farmers and the Warren campaign. She changed her platform, but more importantly, this became the basis of new legislation. So we're excited, very excited to announce that just a couple weeks ago, the Justice for Black Farmers Act of 2020 was introduced by Warren, Gillibrand, and Booker into the Senate. And it is a powerful piece of legislation. For one, it could provide 20,000 farmers, Black farmers with land, which would start to address the loss of nearly 16 million acres of land by Black farmers since 1910 at the hands of the Klan and other white supremacist groups, driving people off their land at the hands of the USDA, discriminating against Black farmers and leading to foreclosures. It would also establish a mechanism for paid apprenticeships, kind of like the Conservation Corps was set up, so that younger or new and beginning Black and Brown farmers could receive funds to go and study with these legacy farmers to learn the tools of the trade, and then be able to get their own land. There's funding for the historically Black colleges and universities. There's strengthening of the Civil Rights Office in the USDA, and the USDA is notorious for its really brutal discrimination against Black and Brown folks, as well as women and other marginalized communities, and much more. And I think what astounds me the most is that these are things we've been talking about for decades and decades. And to have worked together as a movement to get this into the national in such a way that it's almost normalized to talk to progressive senators about reparations, right? And it just astounds me. And I know we have a long way to go, but I believe thoroughly in celebrating, at least for a little bit, before we start like critiquing and tearing down. There's a lot of gaps in the bill. It obviously needs to be after We really addressed the rematriation conversation and Indigenous people getting their land back. So there's all of these pieces that need to be addressed, but it's huge. It's really huge. And the way that it brought together Northern and Southern farmers, younger and legacy farmers, means that regardless of the bill's passage, this collective work around naming and defining what we need as a community for our liberation, that allows us to implement pieces of those through our mutual aid networks, even as we wait for the government to get on board. And then the other thing I'll mention is that this is in the realm of institution building, is I'm really, really inspired by the work that's going on in the northeastern part of the US, where Black and brown farmers are working together and recognizing that the governmental institutions and the private institutions are just not set up to serve our needs. And there's a lot of needs for a person to be successful on land and a community to be fed. We're talking about needing access to land, capital, training, markets, technical assistance, all these services. And we've formed what we call our ecosystem of support, where there's different organizations and collectives and institutions working together to try to provide within our own community all of these pieces, right? So, for example, the Black Farmer Fund of New York is a new finance vehicle that can provide grants and low interest loans for folks to get started, right? The Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust works on rematriation of land to Indigenous people first, and also secure permanent land access for BIPOC farmers at affordable prices, right? Then we have the Corbin Hill Food Project, which acts as a food hub, gathering food, paying farmers fair market value for the food, and then getting it to the communities who need it most in New York City. We have Soulfire Farm and Farm School NYC, which are respectively our rural and urban training centers in the Northeast for Black and brown farmers. And then we have Black Farmers United New York, which is the policy branch, which is used for us to advocate for the laws and policies that we need at the state level to make all this work possible, to make sure the funding is there, the regulations work for us. And this is nascent. I mean, I think we started calling it an ecosystem just about a year ago, even as these pieces were happening, but recognizing, one, that no single organization needs to do everything all by themselves, right? And two, that we have so much collective power in our communities to build these mutually intersecting institutions and really redesign our local food systems. So super hopeful about that. Plus, it's really fun because it gives you more excuses to hang out with your busy organizer friends who would not talk to you unless you had a meeting with them about something. So I've really been enjoying building out this ecosystem and just hope that we can make it work. What about you, Fatuma?
I wanted to touch on some of what you were saying, particularly the decolonization and reparations component. So just want to say, that like decolonization is not a metaphor, and we see it being used in so many spaces now, metaphorically to act as if things are happening that really aren't making substantial change. And so it's important that we use our words wisely and towards the actions that we intend for them. And so even a lot of the proposals I've kind of seen, and in my own opinion and theory about truth and reconciliation commissions don't really make sense to me in terms of the historical that brought them about in different spaces or where we are ourselves as a society right now. And, a lot of those conversations happening under the Trump administration and out of fear of uprisings that were going on just really threw me off. And sometimes I feel like these conversations happen out of the context of the reality and violence that we're living in. And so I just want to contextualize a little bit about the reparations conversation. When we look at, the history in terms of, African engineers brought here to grow food and labor stolen from Black people from 1619 to, let's say, 1865, even if we took that time, that's 250 years of slavery. That's 60% of US history. And if we really counted the 100 years of Jim Crow segregation, that's 80% of history. So of our history here. And so when people talk about equal opportunity in that way, we're talking about access in 2 generations to so-called equal opportunity, when people can trace their generations 3 to 20 years being here in equal opportunity, as that's called. And then, you know, there's so many arguments against reparations. Obviously, that argument of slavery happened too long ago doesn't hold water, but also this argument that, you know, some white people will hold of saying, well, you know, my people weren't slave owning ancestors. And what's important in that is to understand that it was about a system that existed. They were policemen, doctors, lawyers, all the things that held up that system. And so there is so much implication in that. And then when we come to these, you know, and when we look at it in terms of like actual statistics and wealth by education level, to know that a white person with less than a high school degree averages $34,700. And that exceeds what a Black person with a college degree makes in terms of wealth, of holding about $23,000. And, you know, I can resonate with that. People are like, how's that possible? When you come from a community that is suffering from so much oppression and particularly economic violence, you are always rising up, but trying to lift the people around you up with you and responding to imminent needs. And so your money flows like that towards your family and communities. And so there's a lot of reasons why that happens. And then just, you know, to mainly say that, like, there's so much to say in that conversation about land loss. But it's interesting when we think about it historically, because the US government successfully pressured post-war German governments to pay Holocaust survivors over almost $100 million, which would be almost $9 billion today in compensation as part of the Luxembourg Agreement. We know that after the passage of 1998 reparations law, the US government finally acknowledged and compensated almost over 80,000 Japanese Americans who were incarcerated as enemy aliens during World War II with payments. And so these conversations have long been existing. People act like they're so pie in the sky. I heard Giuliani going off on it the other day, which I shouldn't have watched, but it was like, that's not what anyone's saying, and just posed in these ways that make it seem like it's this attackive thing. And so really reflecting on like what that healing really means going forward, and, you know, thinking a lot about this adage of, you know, people say, free your mind and the rest will follow. And it's like, free your mind and the rest will follow with action. It's not just enough to free our minds. Some of us, many of us, we're a part of, and we're all different nexuses in these systems of oppression, particularly dominated in a capitalist framework that we all agree to economically, so the byproducts aren't too shocking. So we are going to shift here to some questions in a minute. And I just, before we do that, Leah, wanted to ask you to maybe highlight some things from the Soul Fire policy platform. I just think it's so comprehensive, and it's important for people to know there's people who have been working on these and, you know, collectivizing it, even how it's like a Google Doc in there and you could see it updated. Like, I appreciate it. So if there's anything you want to share about that.
So my daughter Nashima says, the food system is everything it takes to get sunshine onto your plate. And I love thinking about it that way, because along the way, right, we have the involvement of lands and ecosystem, capital and human work and labor and the food itself. So because there's that wide arc, it also means that there's so many points of intersection in the food system and lots of yeses, like lots of right ways to help. So this policy platform was created in collaboration with a lot of folks in the Soul Fire community and the Black farming community. It's constantly, as you know, if you go in there right now, it's probably being updated because people are always adding, and I know we need to clean it up. It's just getting longer and longer. But some examples of things that you can check out and support include the Fairness for Farm Workers Acts, both nationally and also some of the initiatives at the state level. I'm sure, hopefully folks are aware that, you know, with the 1938 passage of the whole package of labor laws, with the original New Deal, things like the 8-hour workday, the right to overtime pay, the right to collectively bargain, to workers' compensation, to a day off, to child labor protections, those were not extended to farm workers or domestic workers specifically because they were and continue to be predominantly Black and brown. And I'm not being sensationalist. If you actually read the committee deliberations in the legislature, that is why they made those exclusions. And we have not rectified that as a nation. So farm workers continue to not enjoy even the most basic and inadequate labor protections. So paying attention to that is, I think, crucial. But then there's also suggestions about things you can do in terms of encouraging the farms in your community to become certified by the Agricultural Justice Project, which our farm is, which means we have an independent third-party auditor come in every year to interview employees privately, to review contracts, working conditions, housing, and ensure that it meets very rigorous standards of safety and dignity for workers. And so in addition to an organic label, it's also important that we have human ethics labels. There's examples in there about ways that you can continue to educate yourself. You know, I mean, Malcolm X says it so well that if someone puts a knife into your back and pulls it out halfway or even all the way, that's not justice, right? We're at a point in our nation where we're not even recognizing the knife of racism, and the only way to be able to recognize it is that self-education and study, so that when you go into a space, a room, an institution, you can see the patterns, you can see how oppression is happening and name it. So check it out. It's on soulfirefarm.org. I think the link got thrown up there, and see where your particular positionality intersects with what the community is asking for, and that's a place of potential action.
Thank you. So in the Q&A, one of the top things that came up was people saying, please acknowledge all the love y'all you're getting in the chat box. We see you, we feel it. Thank you all. And I'm gonna shift us, Leah, to some of the questions, okay? Awesome, and please keep adding them. So I'm gonna start off with a very easy one. Do you have a list of recommended books, podcasts for new folks in the space? I'm gonna start with, BC, Farming While Black, by Leah Penniman here. It really is a great book. Just so much different parts in it, including ceremony holding and trauma and things like that, and not just only the history and the farming components. So that's a great one. I have a couple more. Leah, you have any?
Props. I am going to throw up the link in the chat of my favorite references. Some of them are articles, some are books, but I definitely have to read everything by Dr. Ashanti Reese, Black Food Geographies, all of it. Everything by Dr. Monica White. What else we got to read over here? Obviously, Robin Wall Kimmerer's book we got to read, because that brings together the spiritual and the science and provides that foundational ethos for us. But yeah, I'll throw up a link to my little bibliography of favorites in just a second.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, and then I'll drop in, for more of an international context, one of my favorite films, a short documentary that's free to access by the Global Oneness Project. And it really does a good job of kind of talking about how different farming systems are brought in with particularly missionaries. And this one specifically is in my country of Ethiopia. So I'll drop in info for that, but love that. Karen Washington, simple articles. If you look up, it's not a food desert, it's food apartheid, something that would again go back to some of false solutions, academicizing or using simple words for whole communities is really painful. I've had people come to my farm and say, we're here to visit a food desert. What's going on? And so really reflecting on that type of language, if we're gonna, deal with these problems, and really acknowledging the systematic ways they are. So I love that article. And then lastly, I want to also drop in for you all a really awesome resource from the National Young Farmers, their Racial Equity Toolkit. It has so many good readings in there, different resources for doing land acknowledgements and maps and stuff. So I'll drop that in as well. Thanks for that question. All right, Leah, this one is really going to be, I think, to you. Are there opportunities to restore land rights for Indigenous peoples or use land as a form of reparations to descendants of slaves?
Well, I think, so first of all, I'm not going to speak for any Turtle Island Indigenous people. I think that it's very important that we defer to the original inhabitants of this lands on what rematriation looks like for them, how it will be done, and this will vary from place to place. So we have a relationship with the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican Nation, that's whose land we're on. And when we were getting ready to put this land into a co-op, you know, we'd reached out and said, do you want ownership of this land? Do you want shared ownership of it? How do you want this? You know, the folks that we spoke to at the museum, at the cultural center, were saying that they're in northern Wisconsin. They're trying to hold on to lands now around where they are. So they need money and resource for that. They also need protection of their artifacts and sacred sites back in their homelands, and a place to come for when they do their annual visits to the homelands. And so in collaboration and in relationship of accountability, working on what that looks like, and doing our best to act with humility and accordingly. I will say that it's also important to disentangle, people have very different viewpoints about this, but the idea of rematriation of land really being a Turtle Island Indigenous call for action, and reparations being primarily a descendants of enslaved Africans call for action. And not that there isn't any overlap in terms of the needs of the community, but there to have a sensitivity around language and who feels affinity and ownership over language and who doesn't, right? That said, I think that we're trying our best with the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust to truly create an institution that's about Black Indigenous solidarity and working together on these really sticky issues, even as settler colonialism has done its best to try to divide us and convince ourselves as Black and brown folks that each other is the problem and not the system. I mean, they love when we go at each other and while they, you know, gather up the booty and the land and all of that stuff. And it has taken a lot of trust building and a lot of mistakes and a lot of apology to try to determine the right way forward. So I know Stephanie Morningstar, who is the ED of NEFO, could speak much better to this, but I know they have a thoughtful consultation policy with Indigenous people on any land projects that they're doing to make sure that there is consent and blessing for what's happening, that Indigenous folks have the right of first refusal for any lands that come into the land trust, and that any lands that are held by the land trust that are not going to Indigenous people have what's called a cultural respect easement, which ensures perpetual, forever legal access to those lands by the original stewards, so people can come on and use those lands as well. And I don't have all the answers to it. I think it's really complex, but I think hopefully we can all agree on the fact that 98% of the arable land in this country being white owned is not acceptable. And so there's quite a bit to share around if we reduce that percentage.
Yeah, that was a really thorough response. Thank you. All right, so next question we have is, and I think we've spoke to this a little bit, but a top voted one coming back is, what are the biggest barriers to creating a strong local food system? So in your experience.
Do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I was trying to think about that. There's so, many different things coming to mind. Of course, the first barrier that we see as farmers particularly, and POC is access to land. It's a constant one. And, sometimes we talk about the difficulty that all farmers are facing and the realities of how we make very little income, but it also neglects the fact that some farmers have land and are land rich in that way. And so that barrier to access has been immense. I think the other part of what's difficult in creating strong local food systems is compensating the people who grow the food, whether it's the farmer's market person that you know and see and feels familiar to you, to the ag workers in the field that are really, when we even talk about urban farming, as someone that's, rurally farmed and didn't really think I'd be urban farming, and chose to do it from a justice perspective and to be back home and a part of my community in Denver, to see the same plights that my communities here face, that I see across the world, that we look at and we judge and put on others and exist here, is really what's motivated me. But I don't think that urban farms are places to produce the food for cities in those ways at all. When people are talking about let's grow more on green roofs and all this stuff, that's not sustainable to me, especially as people are being gentrified, out of the city. And that all has to do about economics and creating economic markets and whatnot. But it's, that whole idea that these urban farms are just going to supply food to that level is not realistic. And I think that urban farms have an important role of educating people. Of when people come to my farm, sometimes our farms, we can be hardcore of being like, when you're here, you got to work, because it sucks when people come and they think they helped you, but they didn't, and it's like, so being real, because coming and experiencing that is really understanding like how hard that work is. It really takes mental fortitude. Like there's so many mind things I do with myself in the field. Some days, the land and everything is blessed. And some days I'm like counting minutes for no reason, and work is hard and I might have a little pain, so I think that my role being based in Denver, I can speak to that, and playing a role in part of a POC and urban farming initiative is to really advocate for all of our people. Most farm policies being made in urban centers for rural communities, and our rural communities are really suffering as a consequence. So, Leah, what else would you say?
I mean, I think you covered pretty well what are the challenges in sustainable local food systems. I think that, a lot of it is systemic. It's about where the resources are going versus not going. I mean, you look at just the USDA subsidies alone are fueling a highly corporatized food system that focuses on commodity crops, which are then turned into highly processed foods that don't represent our ancestral food ways and the ways that are best for us in our communities. So I think part of the root cause is figuring out our societal priorities and then shifting resources accordingly. I think of a counterexample where in Costa Rica, my understanding is that they actually pay farmers a monthly stipend for the ecosystem services they provide if they're doing regenerative ag. So the pollinator habitats, the carbon they sequester, the recharge of aquifers, all of these things which make it possible for humans to live on the earth, farmers are actually taking care of that. And so that makes then regenerative farming economically viable, which means then that these products can get to market at a price that people can afford, which means on and on and on. And so I think that, like, yes, community and urban gardens, yes, mutual aid networks and making sure our elders have groceries, yes, like farm to school, and yes, doorstep delivery CSA, all of these things are super important and are helping us get through. And I think fundamentally, we also need a conversation as a nation where we shift our priorities and shift the resources to follow those priorities.
Thank you. All right. So this next question is, what do you mean when you say we don't include food farm work metrics? What kind of metrics aren't included? I'll take a stab at that first. Okay. So when, just to be clear, when we look at, metrics around farming, it's specifically talking to farm owner and operator metrics. And then, of course, even as you try to get into detail around that for POC communities, really complicated, and happy to share with you all a really great report we created for Colorado in terms of what that data around farm and operators are. And the reality is that they're not, the whole amount of people who are actually out there farming. So the National Agricultural Statistical Survey, NAS, provide some data on ag workers, and specifically can track H-2A workers to some degree. As we know, in the United States, about 70% of our ag workers are completely undocumented. When people are talking about, oh, we have H-2A workers and these systems, which I want to highlight that under the Trump administration and this anti-immigration rhetoric, we've increased dramatically by double in just Trump's time, and that holds true statistically for Colorado. We issued as much H-2A visas as Obama did in all of his years, which, you know, that wasn't great either. But the point is that following that kind of path allows people to stay in vulnerable positions without allowing paths towards immigration, and to keep them without protections in a lot of ways. And H-2A work itself is a whole nother story about what those requirements are and the issues we see coming up around it. If we talk about like the housing requirements and how people have historically, you know, are expected to be housed in those, that's a serious issue now under COVID. And the pandemic is really highlighting just how absurd realistically some of those conditions are as we're dealing with communicable and infectious disease in that way. So there's a huge thing around data and communities of color and how stories are told, how that information is gathered, who are data keepers. And so, you know, for us at Frontline, we have a data activist that works with us now. Her name's Casey. She's awesome. And we just have to put our heads down and do that work of collecting the data. So I'll also drop in a link for you all that shows the complete profile across all of Colorado of all the ag workers, both from primary and secondary counts of interviews that got us to a point where we could synthesize and estimate what the numbers were by region, and qualitative information like what languages they speak, what issues they're specifically facing in those places. Because what happens when you don't have those metrics is people can act like it's this bigger, overwhelming problem that no one can, you know, approach, and it's this larger issue when we need to start approaching it. And these are the fundamental problems in our system that we think it's okay to have come to a time where we say that people are essential yet illegal. That is a gross contradiction of capitalism that has really been shored up in these times, particularly of this destructive food system. And so doing that work now of really trying to get that information, and everyone is like, oh, is recognizing its importance. But so metrics like that matter, and the same in like food movements work as we track it. Generally, food systems people, the individuals themselves, are not tracked in that way, and programs aren't necessarily offered in terms of that value chain type work. And it's important because when we talk about even local procurement, people will say like, well, it costs so much more food for the pantries to buy from farmers. But the reality is, yes, it does. But at the end of the day, the people you're trying to send back into the pantry lines are the same people who are the food workers. And it's a shame, you know, and Cesar Chavez said that years ago. What a travesty that in the United States, that those who toil to bring us food go home on empty bellies themselves. And that asks us some deeper, like spiritual questions in a land of 40% food waste, which for me is like, you know, Babylon. It's like horsemen are going to come and stuff. It's a very extreme level. So, Leah, do you want to add anything to that?
I'm just really resonating and struck by the way you phrased that of essential but illegal. And I don't know, I just feeling the heartbreak that of the ways that all of us in some ways are complicit with this system that sees human beings and sees the earth as disposable. So I'm just praying we can make it right. Like I'm praying that this isn't just an intellectual exercise, but that we all, the folks listening, all of us here working together can make it right.
Thanks, Leah. I feel like that was a beautiful way to maybe wrap up. Would you like to offer any last words today? All right. I think that was perfect. So you know, and even when we think of these communities, so much of what I see is entrenched acceptance of what we think poverty should look like and how it's okay for some people to live and be that we wouldn't think for ourselves as nonprofit workers, even as particular types of farmers. And so really inculcating that and yeah, thinking about, you know, some of the actions, and I'll drop in some links, and I know that they'll share out some of the information as well with you all, so that I know it's a lot in the chats as well. And mainly just wanted to say thank you. What a audience. I mean, it was just such a loving audience. So thanks for encouraging us to speak our truth. When we read that, it helps us to be more vulnerable and honest in the ways we think. And thanks for valuing us here today. And with that, I am going to call Mark back up onto stage to lead us into the other parts. Leah, you want to say anything?
Thanks, everyone. Just much love. Really appreciate you.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much, Fatuma and Leah. That was awesome. I use that word a lot, but I think in this case, it's like the deepest meaning of that word of awe in hearing and learning about your stories and hearing the wisdom and insights that you both brought to us. I think we are all basking in that and appreciative, incredibly appreciative for the time that you both made to share those insights and that wisdom with us. So thank you so much for that. And we have a number of questions that we weren't able to get to, so we will share that afterwards. And if Leah and Fatuma have an opportunity to answer those in writing, we'll be sharing a email next week with all the resources that folks have included here, and any answers to questions that might not have been answered that we can get answered, and we'll get that out to folks. So we hopefully will continue to provide opportunities for folks to dig in to all of these this incredible conversation and keep it going. So now we're going to take a quick break and opportunity for you all to have conversations in your virtual tables. Make sure as soon as we break, to turn on your camera and your mic so that you can talk and engage with each other. There is a question on your whiteboard that we encourage you to use as a prompt to have a conversation, but we really want you all to just visit with each other about what you learned, what you got out of it, and how you see it changing and shaping your work going forward. So please take advantage of that opportunity to learn and connect with each other. And then after, when we come back at 10:40, we'll have a chance to participate in the Kathy Underhill Scholarship Award. We're going to see a video highlighting some of the great work of leaders across the state that were award finalists, and then we'll get learn about the award winner for this year and get a chance to hear from that person. And then we're going to have a great conversation. Fatuma is going to be back up on the stage with this year's, as last year's award winner. Fatuma's last year's award winner, back up with this year's award winner and with Kathy Underhill to continue conversation. So you have plenty more great learning insights to come today. So with that, we'll break and see you back at 10:40.